Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan Goodman. I'm co-editor-in-chief of Just Security and professor of law at NYU School of Law. And I just wanted to welcome everyone on behalf of Just Security and the Knight First Amendment Institute to the event for tonight. I want to thank at the outset our speakers. It's a true privilege to have such an august group of individuals, preeminent leaders in the field of human rights advocacy. They're each heroes to many of us, myself included. And they have graciously come here to engage in an open-ended conversation and exercise of critical self-reflection on human rights advocacy in the decades since September 11th. Our event takes place 2 days before the 20th anniversary of the tragic events of 9/11. It's a moment to reflect on those events of that day and also the many human rights violations committed in its wake and in its name. I wish I could claim credit for creating this event and the conceptual framework for tonight's discussion, but it's truly the vision of Jamil Jaffer. If you've selected to watch tonight's event, then you don't want to miss Jamil's deeply thoughtful essay published 2 days ago at Just Security as part of our symposium series for the anniversary of 9/11. It's entitled, "In the War on Terror, What Did Rights Organizations Get Wrong?" ? Jamil is the executive director of the Knight Institute at Columbia University and executive editor of Just Security. He'll be our moderator tonight, so he could not be in better hands. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jamil to introduce the speakers and to start off on our conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks especially to Elisa, Ken, Linda, and Anthony, whom I will introduce to you in just a second. Let me first say something about why we're here. With the 20th anniversary of 9/11 approaching, many of us have been reflecting on these past 2 decades, on the September 2001 attacks themselves, and also on the ways in which our government responded to those attacks. For human rights organizations, this is also an opportunity to look inward. It's a chance for all of us to reassess the decisions that we made and the work that we did over the past 2 decades. Over those 2 decades, human rights organizations have had to make countless decisions about which issues to focus on and which cases and projects to take on, whom to collaborate with, how to engage with government officials or whether to engage with government officials, and of course, how to frame complex issues for the public. Some of those decisions involve questions of tactics, others involved much larger questions of strategy and values, and a lot of those decisions were difficult at the time. So what we're going to do tonight is reflect on the decisions that the US human rights community made, to consider why we made them, which of them were most consequential, and which decisions we might make differently today, knowing what we know now. Obviously, none of us here speaks for the human rights community, which is diverse in a lot of different ways. This probably goes without saying, but all of us here will be relying on our own experiences and offering our own perspectives. My plan is to moderate a conversation for about an hour and then to take some audience questions. If you'd like to submit a question, I encourage you to do so. You can do that through the Q&A feature on Zoom. With that overly long preamble out of the way, let me introduce everyone, though I suspect that all of our panelists are well known to anyone who's dialed into this event. So first, Elisa Massimino is the Robert Drinan Chair in Human Rights at Georgetown. She was on the staff of Human Rights First for 27 years and served as that organization's executive director between 2008 and 2018. One of the many important projects she took on in that role was to assemble a coalition of retired generals and admirals to oppose the torture of prisoners in US custody. That coalition had a really significant role in bringing US interrogation policy back into compliance, or at least into relative compliance with the Geneva Conventions. Great to see you, Elisa, and thanks for joining us. Anthony has been the executive director of the ACLU for 20 years. Under his leadership, the ACLU filed major lawsuits relating to many aspects of the so-called war on terror, torture, detention, surveillance, extrajudicial killing. And the organization also took on a huge amount of immigrants' rights and anti-discrimination work, including here in New York City. Anthony also has the more dubious distinction of having hired me at the ACLU 19 years ago. Anthony, good to see you, and thanks for being here. Ken Roth is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, a position he's held since 1993. Under his leadership, Human Rights Watch conducted dozens of in-depth investigations into the US government's counterterrorism policies. Many of those investigations, including investigations relating to mass surveillance and the CIA's secret prisons overseas, exposed serious abuses and led to important policy reforms. Ken, thank you for being here. And then last but certainly not least, Linda Sarsour was the Executive Director of the Arab American Association from New York from 2005 until 2017, becoming a powerful voice for the growing Arab population in Bay Ridge and the surrounding neighborhoods of Brooklyn. More recently, she's been a prominent and influential advocate for other human rights and civil liberties issues, including mass incarceration, women's rights, and immigrants' rights. Linda, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Anthony, I want to start by asking you about the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And I'm sure that, like the rest of us, you were scared and you were disoriented and you were angry. But you were also, unlike most of the rest of us, running a major civil liberties organization.
For a week.
For a week. You'd been the executive director for 1 week before the attacks. So I'm wondering, what were the biggest challenges for you in those first days and first weeks? And what were the biggest challenges for the ACLU at that time? And though I know this question will be difficult to answer, what do you know now that you wish you had known then?
Yeah, that's the real question for all of us. And let me just thank you, Jamil, for putting me in such good company with Linda and Ken and Elisa. It's just great to be with you, at least virtually, on this anniversary. It feels like a huddle that's quite necessary. So look, I had just started the week before 9/11 and was in DC when the attacks happened. So I was not in New York City where the headquarters is, but I was in Washington, which was also, obviously impacted by the attack on the Pentagon and the almost attack on the Capitol. And there are many issues rifle through my head when you ask me this question about, like, what was that like in the beginning? And for the ACLU, we knew our history because we had been through, like many of the other human rights groups, we had been through these moments of crisis or national or moments of challenges to national security, that we knew that civil liberties would become a kind of a major issue as government responded and overreacted. And I had spent, even though I was brand new to the organization, I spent the summer before in the archives at Princeton and reading the history of the ACLU during other moments of crisis. And so the Palmer raids, from which the ACLU was born with Mitchell Palmer, was really kind of the first crucible that we were born out of. And then I think the one that was particularly instructive to me was during World War II, when the ACLU almost split apart because of the question of representing Japanese American internees. The headquarters balked. The San Francisco office took the case, even though the headquarters told them not to. And we made history, and we ended up being on the right side because of a renegade affiliate. And then obviously in the 50s, it's a kind of instructive history because the ACLU actually shrugged. Atlas shrugged in the 50s. We did not do what we ought to have done to fight the House on Un-American Activities. We capitulated to the pressures of J. Edgar Hoover, expelled the communists from our national board, turned over the minutes of our board meetings to the FBI at the time. Not a good moment for us. And so all of this was rifling through my head when 9/11 hit. I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to be the guy who's like the 50s director. I want to be like the San Francisco affiliate and do right by the Constitution and civil liberties. And lamentably, we didn't have a national security project. That's why the best hire I ever made, Jamil, was when I hired you. I say that publicly, not when I say that behind your back. So I'm not just saying this to butter up to you.
Thank you, Anthony.
But we didn't have a national security project. And in the first days, I literally grabbed people from the Immigrants' Rights Project, from the Free Speech Project, from the Prison Project. And we cobbled together a team of people before we could hire experts. So just getting the expertise up within the organization. We had a national security project, which had been jettisoned the years previous. And because, who was thinking that national security would be an issue in the early
I think it was closed in like 1990, right?
1990.
End of history, yeah.
Exactly. With Mort Halpin was one of the founders, and Kate Martin and others were spun off, and then we needed to build it back because we needed it then. So just getting the expertise and the staff, and luckily I found tremendous people like you and others who came to work for the organization and gave this depth. But I think what I wish I knew then, what I knew now, I compared the moment after 9/11 to the moments after Trump got elected, and they couldn't have been more different. In the aftermath of 9/11, the ACLU was sounding the alarm bell with Elisa, with Ken, with Linda, with others, but we were really lone voices, and we were very much drowned out by liberals, by progressives. I remember having a huge row with an NPR correspondent who I will not name because I don't kiss and tell, or I don't argue and tell. And this NPR correspondent was telling me that tone it down, that we needed to get behind the president and do what we needed to do to get behind, to fight the war on terror and to make sure that 9/11 didn't happen again. And this was from good old liberals. I remember the arguments I had with Senator Wellstone before he died. And, Ted Kennedy voted for the Patriot Act, right? As did Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden. So let's remember that our allies were not so with us at the moment. Only Russ Feingold voted against the Patriot Act. So, and I didn't know that we could actually bring public opinion around the way we ended up doing. I thought we would be forever in this kind of, oppositional kind of desert. And we tried, we certainly were focused on it, but I didn't know that it would turn as quickly as it did. And if I had done that, I would have built a different type of, infrastructure to mobilize communities. I was mostly focused on build the lawyers, hire the litigators like you, Jamil. I didn't think about citizen activism quite in the same way. So actually, some of the best activism that happened right away was the Bill of Rights defense committees that we had nothing to do with, that were organized citizen efforts to oppose the Patriot Act. With Donald Trump, we were much readier to kind of like mobilize the people because we knew the people would be with us. We launched this big thing called People Power, and we got much more focused on kind of citizen activism. So I wish I had kind of anticipated more of bringing the public along with us and maybe being less law-centric in our advocacy in the early days. No offense, of course. The work you did for us was fantastic. But I think we could have been a little bit more diverse in thinking about our advocacy.
Elisa, did you want to jump in on that? Or?
Yeah, I wonder, Anthony, if you remember, I was just recollecting this, that the ACLU convened us about 2 or 3 days after the attacks in the basement of the Mott House across the street from the
I do remember.
And it was, I don't think we could have a meeting like that today, which is one of the things that's kind of striking. We're talking about the things we wish we had done differently or wish we had known. But, in that room, crowded in that room was, the Phyllis Schlafly group, the Eagle Forum, People for the American Way, right. All, just across the political spectrum. And within about 2 days, I think we came up with these 10 principles.
Yeah, I remember.
We knew immediately that everything that we believed in and stood for was going to be under attack. And so we found a way across a really diverse group of, you know,
Paul Wayrich, Bob Barr.
you know, to come up with 10 principles that we urged, you know, the government and the American people to embrace and remember. You know, I don't think we envisioned everything that went wrong, but we envisioned a lot of it. And we knew that the fight was going to be fierce. And so, you know, one of the things that the ACLU did was that convening of as broad a group as possible to try to agree on shared values. And the Venn diagram with some of those groups was pretty narrow, but we found a way. And I think that was a really important, you know, it was a period of intense pressure for a long time for all of us. And I think we rose to the occasion in terms of, I know the organizations represented here very much, you know, at our best in terms of collaboration, coordination, you know, playing the different roles that we all had to play.
I know Ken wants to jump in. I do have one, you know, I think it'd be worth thinking about what effect the articulation of that common ground had in the longer term. So we had, I wasn't in that meeting. You know, I was just a very junior lawyer at the ACLU, but we have groups, diverse groups, different political perspectives, coming together to articulate these shared values, or at least, or even shared principles. And I wonder, was that important in holding civil society together, or at least holding it more together than it might otherwise have been? But don't answer that now. I want to let Ken jump in.
All right, well, Jamil and I can try to address that as well. I mean, for me, the hard part was not so much articulating what we stood for, because, you know, we do that all the time. It's not always popular. You know, we'd seen other terrorist attacks in other countries that, you know, Human Rights Watch is used to dealing with, and we tend to see the overreaction. So, I mean, I remember, you know, kind of in a precursor of the COVID period, you know, we weren't in the office. Our office was closed, but we were, you know, we put together a statement within about 2 days, which was a good statement, you know, and really articulated the principles. And the fact that other groups were doing the same, you know, helped us in that sense. I mean, this was not a lonely thing. There was, I think, a pretty clear position in the rights community, you know, not without detractors. I mean, I remember giving a speech at our annual New York fundraiser in early November. And one of my big donors came up. I had said, you know, we got to make sure not to fall into torture. And he came up and said, if my daughters were taken by a terrorist, I'd want them tortured.
Yeah.
You know, and I ended up losing that donor, although on other grounds, not on this one. You know, but so there was pushback, but it wasn't, for me, it wasn't that hard to state the principles. That's what we're here for. I think our biggest failing, at least I'll speak for myself here, I didn't realize how bad it was going to get.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know, in retrospect, you can look at this, you know, the evil genius of Cheney, his willing collaborators with, you know, John Yoo and company, Alberto Gonzalez. But I just didn't think it would be such overt flouting of basic principles, you know, the black sites, the torture, the indefinite detention. And, you know, that was a failure of imagination. I mean, you know, in retrospect, it's easy to say we should have known, but we didn't. You know, it was for the first several months, we were articulating principles, but we didn't have anything concrete to condemn. And even as we began to learn what was going on, it came out in, you know, in bits and pieces. And, you know, even something like Abu Ghraib, which was, you know, a revelation to most people and shocking, was in an odd way a gift to the CIA, because Abu Ghraib was, you know, such an amateurish operation that it made it seem like, oh, that's the torture, you know, and it didn't show it as sophisticated and systematic as it really was. So, I mean, in retrospect, you know, I wish we had not given any benefit of the doubt to the Bush administration. I wish we just assumed the worst from the outset, but we didn't. We just couldn't conceive that the US government would be so completely horrible. And it took a while.
That sounds, yeah, that sounds exactly right to me. I remember when we were reading these news stories from Dana Priest and Bart Gellman and later Carlotta Gall in the Post, the Times, about the torture of prisoners in U.S. custody. And I think, our initial reaction was, this can't be right, or if it's right, it's got to be this, totally aberrational case. And it took us a while just to believe that it was actually happening. I remember that. Linda, I want to ask you a version of the same question. You weren't yet running the Arab American Association of New York on 9/11, but I think you were volunteering there either then or very soon after. And you were working with a community that was deeply affected, not just by the attacks, but by the government's response to the attacks as well. And I think that this episode has been all but forgotten. But in the weeks after the 9/11 attacks, the FBI and the Immigration Service rounded up hundreds of immigrants, most of them Arab or South Asian, almost all of them Muslim, falsely intimating to the public that all of these people were connected in some way to the 9/11 attacks. And you were dealing with that roundup and with the ripple effect of those detentions, as well as with a spike in hate crimes against people perceived to be Arab or Muslim, which is the perceived to makes it a very broad category. So I guess I'm, wondering, what were the biggest challenges for you in those days? And I guess I'll ask you the same question I asked Anthony, which is, what do you know now that you wish you had known then?
Thank you, Jamil. First off, I'm really honored and humbled to be amongst this group. And I've been having these conversations a lot in the last few days, and always feel like I have a lump in my throat, which is actually not, not something that I'm known for. But it's been really triggering to think about what happened in the aftermath of 9/11, because I grew up in one of the largest Muslim American communities in New York State and in the country. And I watched people who look like me, people who look like my fathers and my father, my brothers, my uncles, who were being rounded up. I mean, I watched imagery of raids on entire apartment buildings in Brooklyn, watching men be asked to lay down on their bellies on the sidewalks of Brooklyn. We're not talking about the sidewalks of Saudi Arabia or Bangladesh or Pakistan. We're talking about the sidewalks of a liberal democracy in the United States of America. I wasn't naive to injustice. I didn't believe we lived in a country where there wasn't injustice, but it was the first time I ever watched it so overtly, so in my face, and also against people who look like me. I was a college student. I was an aspiring English, high school English teacher. That's what I wanted to do with my life. I was never an aspiring activist. I never wanted to be a target of the right wing. That wasn't exactly in the cards for me. But when 9/11 happened, I just happened to be bilingual. I happened to speak both English and Arabic fluently. I happened to be of this community. And I went to the mosque about maybe 2 Fridays after 9/11, and I watched a group of women walk in from that lived in the same dwelling, crying, saying somebody came to our house and took our loved ones. And I just sat there like, what do you mean? And I remember the most clear image I have from those very few short days after 9/11 is going to the imam's office at our mosque. And our imam is the religious spiritual leader who was an immigrant from Egypt. And I remember going into his office and saying, hey, look, these women are crying. I think some sort of law enforcement came and, kidnapped their husbands. And the imam looked at me and said, what am I supposed to do? I don't know what to do. So to see the helplessness of our leadership in the Muslim community, and also in the community that I grew up in and worked in for, now for 2 decades, these are people who fled political persecution. They fled police states and dictatorships. They came to America because someone sold them this idea that this is the land of freedom. This is where you can be who you are. This is the land of due process. This is the land where you get to stand before a judge. This is the land where you are innocent until proven guilty. And all of a sudden, in literally one day, all of that dream that was sold to them was taken and stripped from them. And, for me, I started as a translator, and that's the only skill that I had. I'm not a lawyer. I wasn't in law school. I wasn't a constitutional law expert. I wasn't an organizer, an activist. I had one skill at the time that I could offer, which is that I could help this community translate really pain and trauma and to try to find their loved ones. And I remember just as a young 21-year-old running around, detention centers in the Northeast with families just trying to figure out how we can find them. And I remember immediately, and remember also that what I always feel like is so interesting about having this conversation 20 years. And this is when I know that people are going to understand how old I am, even though people think I'm relatively young. Like we didn't have, Google.com. Like we didn't have social media or Facebook where I can be like, hey, any lawyers out there want to help me? Like DM me here. Like that's just not how the world was. And so we were doing everything like phone book style. We still had dial-up internet in 2001. I mean, that's the era that this horrific attack happened. And, and I'll end by saying, I was saying this to someone today that, this global war on terror, and specifically the way it was implemented domestically and continues to be implemented, there's a new conversation, like it just, okay, but it's 20 years later, where are we now? And I just want to leave people with a story of a young college student, who was a college student at Brooklyn College. His name was Fahid Hashmi. He was a young Pakistani who had went to London for a winter vacation, allowed an acquaintance to sleep at his apartment in London, allowed this man to use his cell phone, which is something that we all do normally. I do that all the time. And when he was on his way back to New York, he was, detained by the United States government. And they charged him with conspiracy to aid terrorists. And that was because the man who was his acquaintance was being tracked by the CIA and ended up going back to Pakistan and handing over a duffel bag that had apparently, waterproof socks and raincoats. And somehow it got into the hands of someone's uncle, cousin, you know how that works, that was affiliated with the Al-Qaeda at the time. And Fahid's still in jail today. He was a bright, brilliant young man. His professor, Jean Theo Harris, who's the author of The Rebellious Life of Rosa Parks, a very prominent voice in the human rights kind of space, has written about him, has protested on his behalf, and he's still there today. So the aftermath of this global war on terror still is significant here today. And what I wish I would have known 20 years ago, I kind of, as a young person, I wasn't really sure. I didn't really understand how fast I could get into this kind of intersectional space. I had a feeling that bad things were happening to other communities. And I just had to figure out where those people were and who those people were that were doing the work. And, it took me a while to kind of get into that space, maybe 5 to 6 years to get into a more intersectional lens on how to talk about how criminal justice intersects with, our immigrant rights and the way that we engage in detention of immigrants, racial justice, and how that is kind of the overarching concept, and even the racialization of Muslims, because Muslims could be white, they could be Eastern European, they could be South Asian, they could really be anybody. But then the racialization of Muslims, it was something that I wish I would have had that concept prior, or not prior, but I would have understood that a little bit more to be able to do this work. But what I hope that we have now is this idea that we can't have these silo fights anymore. And that really has been my personal mission and role in the larger progressive movements that I'm a part of. You can't tell me that you're going to talk about ending mass incarceration and not talk to me about, closing Guantanamo, or even closing Guantanamo North in places like Indiana, that we're not going to talk about criminal justice reform without also talking about national security reform, that we're not going to silo and use kind of Muslims, and that we've been used many times in 20 years as a group of people who have been almost like a negotiating chip when it comes to immigration. I remember a big blowout that happened with progressives back in 2010, where we were advocating for closing national security loopholes in a comprehensive immigration reform bill. And many major organizations were like, look, you're lucky if this even gets to the table. Like, you can't really get everything you want right now. Like, let's go with it. We'll try to put some markups. We'll try to do that. And at the end of the day, what happened is we lost anyway. Yeah. So the groups that were more powerful than us, that had more money than we did, they went ahead without heeding to the calls of marginalized people, particularly those who are Muslim and of Arab and South Asian descent. And at the end, we lost anyway. So the question was, could we have been in solidarity and been able to, lose, but lose with some integrity? And lastly, Anthony, another great hire that you made at the ACLU is Hina Shamsi.
No, I know that.
There is no way that our community in New York would have been able to get through a lot of the trauma and the work without the brilliance of her, the way that she was able to engage in movement lawyering in a way that was dignifying the communities that she was helping to defend. So
Hina,
shout out to Hina.
Dalia Hashad was our first
Mhm.
outreach coordinator to
Wow.
the Arab and Muslim community. We've had many great other staff.
Nusrat Chaudhry.
You hired
Nusrat.
from us.
And also on staff at the ACLU was Greg Nojine, who there was a question in the chat who asked us, were there Muslim groups in the meeting at the Mott House? And partly because Greg was on our payroll and was our national security expert in our DC office. He wasn't in the legal department. He was on the policy side, helped us build the bridges out to the communities and have folks at the meeting who were from the communities. And, you know, I just want to foot stomp and underscore what Linda said, the impact and the fear that gripped the Muslim, South Asian, Arab, brown communities in America were extreme. And that was really our primary focus in the early years. I pulled up our annual report. That's what it looked like. It looked very pretty, wasn't it? But from 2002, this was January 2002, we didn't talk about any of your cases, Jamil, I'm afraid to say, right? It was all about know your rights pamphlets in 7 different languages, Arabic, Farsi, Urdu, Punjabi. It was all about suing the airlines for them turning away Arabs and Muslims from boarding on airplanes. And I think the big docket, the big cases would come subsequent, but the early days was very much legal assistance. You know, I think it ended up being 1,100 people that Ashcroft announced that he had detained and summarily deported. We even hired a film crew to follow some of the folks to Pakistan so that we could kind of pull together our own documentary on the individuals who were deported. And it was a 3-alarm fire in the Muslim community. And I don't think we can underscore that enough, Linda. I think you're exactly right. Thank you.
But Linda, there's something else you said that really resonated with me, which is this talk about national security exceptions, which you know, in retrospect, I think all of us should have been quicker to recognize that those were not national security exceptions; they were effectively Muslim exceptions. You know, and I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I feel like I was maybe a little bit naive, you know, when reading through the Patriot Act and subsequent legislation, things that were framed as national security, I at least initially took on their face as surely this is about national security, and now obviously everybody knows that they weren't.
Jamil, just 2 finger on that one, because Human Rights First had such a big part of our program was working with immigrants and refugees. You know, we had a direct window into that happening in real time. And you know, one of the things that was so striking to me was when we went in to the Justice Department to ask questions about rounding up Muslims, and you know, this long list, they had names of people that they were just going to round up. And you know, we were looking for some sign that there was a strategy related to national security behind any of it. And we said, surely you're not just doing this like just randomly rounding up people who are Muslim or seem Muslim to somebody and hoping that you're going to catch some terrorists. And that is precisely what they were doing. You know, as fearful as that community was from the outside, the ignorance and fear inside the government was so deep. And to me, that was a revelation, because I think my naivete was really about that there was some level of competence inside the government on these issues. And that early meeting just completely stripped that away. There was nothing there driving, there was no strategy behind that. It was just fear-driven prejudice.
Can I ask all of you about, I mean, we've been talking about the first days and weeks, but what about later? I'm wondering, you know, what were the points at which the human rights community or your respective organizations could have gone in different directions? Like, what were the most important decision points? Because I think that, you know, my guess is that people sort of on the outside of human rights organizations get the sense that human rights organizations just did what anyone would expect them to do after, in response to government policies of the kind that we were all responding to. But the truth is, as you all know, you had to make decisions every day about how to use your resources and, what cases to take on, et cetera, all sorts of decisions about, how to frame issues. Where were the really important decision points? Like, where did you feel like it could have gone either way? Elisa, you want to start with that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one thing that felt to me like a fork in the road, and we fought it, but we gave up fighting it because we weren't getting anywhere, was the whole war on terror frame. The frame of this as war and not crime enabled so much of what followed, and we fought it, and we couldn't make any headway with the public, with policymakers across the board, politically, and it was, I don't know what else we could have done, but losing that early narrative frame, cost us so much. I think that was one of the real decision points, I think.
And maybe I could add to that, because I think it's, I agree with Elisa that was one of the big, it wasn't a decision, because I think we all fought the war characterization, but and we're all aware of rhetorical wars like the drug war, which was bad enough because it was kind of an excuse for all kinds of more classic human rights abuses. But this was something different, and we and it was a kind of a moving target. I mean, at first, it was really, I think it was just meant to say this is no holds barred, anything goes. But we didn't know what that meant precisely. What complicated it too is that there was, in fact, very quickly a real war. There's Afghanistan. So that kind of undercut us a bit, because what we were really opposing was the characterization of the global war on terrorism. There obviously was a war in Afghanistan. We then, the next big point where that kind of rose up was, you remember the Jose Padilla case? This was this Muslim man arrested in Chicago, ostensibly going to do a dirty bomb. But rather than at first, charging him with a crime, he was treated as an enemy combatant under this war paradigm. And we actually did fight back on that, pointing out that, if he was really an enemy combatant, they could have just shot him in O'Hare, rather than arrest him. They didn't go that far. But ultimately, they backed off and they did charge him. But then where I think the war paradigm came to the fore, it's in two things. One is that, they didn't accept that human rights rules applied. But then they didn't really accept war rules either. Remember Alberto Gonzalez saying, "Oh, the Geneva Conventions, those are quaint and obsolete," or whatever the words are used. Which really meant that even though there is language in there prohibiting torture, prohibiting inhumane treatment, they just weren't going to deal with that because this was a different kind of war that somehow wasn't governed by either the Geneva Conventions or by human rights law. And then, where my organization spent a lot of time was when the focus of the global war on terrorism moved beyond Afghanistan, because then we were on comfortable ground in the sense that there was no recognizable war. There's no active battlefield and conflict between the United States and anybody else. What there was targeted killings. And so, one of the most important investigations I think we did was in Yemen, where we went to the site of these drone attacks and showed, who was being killed. And, some of them, they got who they thought they were going to get. Sometimes they just completely got, school buses or whatever, but the rules that they were using were the wrong rules, because this wasn't a war. In a war, you can shoot to kill the combatant on the battlefield. Yes. But this was not a war. This was something else. And they should have been using law enforcement standards, which require, efforts to arrest that allow using lethal force only in response to an imminent lethal threat. And it took a long time to get, finally Obama at his National Defense University speech said the right words. He said, okay, we're going to kind of repudiate this war paradigm. We're going to only kill people if there's an imminent lethal threat. And then they started playing games with what imminent meant.
Yeah.
And it turned out that imminent meant, any foreseeable action down the road that it might be hard to stop. So they were actually just kind of continuing the war paradigm, but not admitting it. But I do think that, to this day, what I hope Biden does to, he's ended the forever war in Afghanistan. He has an opportunity now to end the forever global war against terrorism. And that, of course, is the only remaining legal basis for Guantanamo. It is the only reason why you still have these drone attacks in places like Pakistan or Somalia or Yemen. There's a lot of evil that comes from it. And I think we have to kind of refocus on that issue.
Anthony?
I was going to wait for Linda to see if she wants to jump in, but if you want me to go, Linda? It's cool. Look, I mean, there were so many forks in the road, and the ones I think I focus on are the ones I wish I had taken the other fork. So because most of the forks in the road that we took, we ended up on a good path doing important work at a time that really mattered. But I'm trying to be reflective and self-critical. And again, I'm just speaking from myself and take full agency and responsibility for any of the kind of wrong turns I took with my organization, even though I'm really proud of the work we did early on. And I think, the war paradigm, the war and terror paradigm was one we fought, but I wish we had just kind of never fallen prey to the use of it, because I think it was kind of like it was you found yourself in that trap. The biggest ones for me that I really regretted, if you will, is once the full evidence of the commission of torture and the fact that we had acted so unlawfully, both under domestic law and international law, right? A lot of the work that came out of your litigation, Jamil, with the Freedom of Information Act that you and Amrit Singh, I want to make sure I give Amrit equal credit because you weren't the only one doing it, but that, the fact that that litigation led to the full record and the documents that came out that the government was authorizing torture at the highest levels of our government. And you remember this, Jamil, we had a whole discussion that I shut down about whether or not we would call for impeachment around Cheney or Rumsfeld, Bush, or any of the officials who authorized torture up the chain of command. And, I had only known of the ACLU taking an impeachment decision in the context of Richard Nixon. And I thought that Richard Nixon's impeachment effort was a kind of a case of, a case of only in first impression. And I thought that we would never really get to a point where we would call for the impeachment of a sitting president or of a vice president or of, secretaries in the cabinet. And I didn't think it would render much. And having been through 2 impeachment processes with Donald Trump, it was incredibly important to do those impeachment processes on Trump to kind of label the illegality of President Trump's actions as clearly as we did through 2 failed impeachment processes, because you ultimately did, failed, they impeached, but they didn't remove. And I wish we had actually taken that much more seriously. Once we got all the evidence around the illegality and the unlawfulness of the torture and abuse that was in place, in real time, laying the groundwork for accountability, so that then Obama could not so easily sell us downriver when he decided to look forward and not backward, because that was his mistake. That wasn't my mistake. I did not agree with that, obviously. Elisa, Ken will tell you a story about it. They tell you, but but I think we didn't do enough to make that pivot from the president to look forward and not back. We made it too easy for him to make that. So I own that. I think the other piece that I think,
thought, Anthony, that you were. This is all very kind of inside baseball stuff, but I actually thought that you were the one who was pushing. I remember you wanted to run that ad. You did run that ad, and I think Italian papers, and then in the New York Times
Yeah,
showing
yeah, yeah,
Obama transforming into Bush, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's very controversial at the time.
Yeah.
Even on the left, a lot of people said you're not being fair to Obama.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And in retrospect, I think you were, you're right to warn him about that.
But I wasn't hard enough on Rumsfeld, Cheney,
Right.
Ashcroft, Bybee. I kind of gave them more of impeachment seemed like only that could be reserved for Richard Nixon. It should have been reserved for all of them, frankly, is what I think. We should have impeached a bunch of them. Now that I've been through 2 impeachment processes, I'm all for it, And I guess the other piece I would just say is that, I think the inflection point for us early on around Gitmo, we made a conscious decision not to prioritize Gitmo in the early days of the war on terror. And thank God, and I will say this because Michael Ratner has been maligned in death wrongly. And thank God for Michael Ratner and the Center for Constitutional Rights for running the gauntlet on the legal defense and the whole attack on the constitutionality of Guantanamo and the military commissions. Because had it not been for CCR, we would not have had those 3 important Supreme Court cases. We jumped in late. We jumped in as amicus. We're still doing work in Guantanamo. I still have lawyers going to Guantanamo, defending the military commissions, high value detainees. I spent $13 million on these military commissions still, and the meter's still running. But it was CCR that identified Guantanamo as this legal black hole. And you remember, Jamil, because we had a bunch of these debates within the organization. We were really divided. And ultimately I decided, okay, we're going to focus on the domestic civil liberties issues. And somehow I put Guantanamo as someone else's purview. It was Ken's and Elisa's, CCR's purview in the initial days. And it ended up being fine because Michael Ratner did a brilliant job. There's nothing we could have done that would have been better. But thank God for CCR in that place. And I will say this, donors always say, oh, there's so much overlap and there's so much duplication of activity among the NGOs. Well, you want a diversified NGO sector so that when we make different decisions strategically, that there's someone focused on a set of issues. Because if it had not been for CCR, I don't think we would have had the impact on Gitmo the way we had it. And you can record this because I don't normally give such a strong public service announcement to another organization, but I really do think Michael Ratner and CCR deserve a lot of credit for that.
Linda, how about you? What about, are there decision points over the last 20 years, places where you think, the human rights community could have gone in different directions? Which of those points was most consequential?
There's so many moments, Jamil, where I felt like I was very small in the larger kind of progressive human rights spaces. And I mean, when I say I felt small, I felt like it wasn't about me. It was about the communities that I came from. And it was about being a grassroots organizer, not being a lawyer, not being someone in academia, not being a quote unquote expert, except that I felt like I came from a community that was an expert in the impact that the things people were talking about and studying and researching and writing reports about were actually things that our community was feeling and reeling from. When I think about the conversation that we have about policing, for example, there's no debate amongst progressives that policing is structurally racist in America, that the system of policing is structurally racist. But is yet to hear people say that our national security apparatus is structurally racist. It is structurally going after people based on nationality, often on race, on political views, and knowing that the people who have been the most directly impacted by the global war on terror have been Muslims, those perceived to be Muslims, and Black people. And so, kind of the answer would be that if I wish that more folks that were working on kind of law enforcement accountability and people who were, working on crafting this narrative about the problematic nature of policing in general, this idea that police really can't be reformed because the core of it is racist. And is there that opportunity for organizations and movements to have one in that direction when it came to national security policy. I think that we haven't gotten there. There's been a lot of moments also across the movements where we could have went in another direction much faster. I remember in the initial conversations around after the Department of Homeland Security was created, and then after that, obviously the way in which ICE, kind of started engaging in enforcement on the border and really within our communities, not just Muslim communities, but really against many immigrants of color. There was this immediate, reflex from the movement to be like, okay, we got the tagline. The tagline is, we are not the terrorists. And it was kind of like, oh, really? So you're not the terrorist, then who is the terrorist? So this idea that you left, this conversation was left so wide open that there was this justification of saying, okay, not the Central Americans, not the people coming on the border, because those people are searching for a better life. But there are other people who are terrorists and we need to go there. There was even a moment in the immigrant rights movements where it was, we are not the terrorists, we are not the criminals. And who are the criminals? Those were Black people. Those were, US born, Latino communities or whatever it was. So there was a lot of moments where the movement could have initially engaged in solidarity and looking at the connections between national security and the policing apparatus in the United States and how it impacts people of color. We could have had one big whole conversation that really could have built a lot of power. And I think there were times when there were so many conversations, even when we started in New York around, community policing, the Community Safety Act, and there was a lot of kind of progressive legislation that was being put forth together in New York. And there was a point around this inspector general, and that would be kind of overseeing policies and practice of the New York Police Department. But in light of, the specific context of the inspector general bill was really around the surveillance of Muslim communities. And there were some people, not many, but there were some people who opposed that. They were like, why are we mixing this up? It's not the same, is stop and frisk the same as, unwarranted surveillance of Muslim communities in the context of national security? We could pull up op-eds in New York of people who wrote in support of the commissioner, of the NYPD commissioner at the time, that, would be considered to be, quote, liberals, and saying, hey, who are they supposed to stop? The white grandmas? We had elected officials who were Democrats in New York who basically said that exact line, like, what are you asking us to do? Stop old white grandmothers in the train stations? Like, we know who we need to stop. So I wish that we had made those connections, a long time ago. And I think those connections are starting to be made. And I know this is going to be a controversial statement, but there were some blessings that came out of Donald Trump. Whether or not, I'm not going to say that the 4 years were lost under this fascist administration, but he forced us into seeing the intricacies and the intersections between the struggles that we were a part of in a way that was so overt, like you couldn't even deny it anymore. And he taught us that solidarity was the way to build power against fascist policies, regardless of which administration we were going to be organizing under. And also what Donald Trump actually did is it gave platforms to people like me to say, oh, wait a minute, you all want to register with the Muslims? Is that the new thing now? Where were you in 2003 when Muslims were being registered by the US government, right, under the Department of Homeland Security? And even during the elections when Ted Cruz was like, let's monitor all the mosques. And the Muslims were like, oh, which ones are left? Because you already monitor our mosques. And so it was unfortunately, this like hyperbole of the Trump and the Republican kind of, fiasco of an election allowed us to say these things already happened. You just weren't paying attention to us, or you were willing to negotiate Muslims and those that look like us out of progressive policies, or allowed elected officials and sometimes labor and others to say, hey, we're with you on this, but don't bring us on this national security situation over here. We don't want to deal with that. We want to deal over here with this. And I think we could have alleviated a lot of harm and moved a lot more progressive policies forward if we would have gotten together on this frame at least 15 years ago.
And great points. And I wonder whether, like, to what extent that's about. When I look at, I just started at the ACLU in 2002, and we were, it felt like the organizations that represented Muslim Americans or American Arab community. These were at that time relatively informal organizations that didn't have staffs, were made up mainly of volunteers, had very little funding. The world looks very different now, at least to me. These communities are very well organized now, and can be. It's more. I don't know. I don't want to suggest that I'm sort of putting the blame on the Muslim community for not being organized, but at the time, it felt like there weren't a lot of organizations to partner with. Now, maybe that's my fault. I just didn't see those organizations. But now it feels like that there's a whole field of these organizations that have resources, have staff, have the ability to get things done politically, have the ability to make their voices heard. The world looks very different to me now than it did 20 years ago.
I mean, I think overall, Jamil, your observation is right. I mean, there were some organizations, CARE was created in the 1990s. They had already at least 12 chapters around the country by that time. We had the Arab American Institute, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, who had been targets of the government for their political activism prior to 9/11. And so that, of course, is very minuscule compared to a large Muslim community and an Arab American community who often is not Muslim. So that's the other thing, so Arab American communities who were impacted by 9/11 who happen not to be Muslim. And the interesting thing is, yes, there are more Muslim organizations now and maybe more staff and a little more organization, but really so far for us to go. And to be quite honest, we could be farther along. And one of the things that has happened is that if you look at some of the major kind of funders, or philanthropists or even philanthropic organizations in the United States of America, other than groups like the Open Society, and maybe, one or two other funders that give significant resources in this kind of field that they call the MASA field, the Muslim Arab South Asian field, we're really not in the portfolios. And it goes back to my original point that I made just a few minutes ago, which is that we are not seen as part of the larger racial justice movement in the United States of America, that the issues that impact Muslims are not under that frame. So for example, in some philanthropic organizations, we were kind of siloed into portfolios, literally were called like national security portfolios. And we were getting money to do work that was specific to Islamophobia or specific to, surveillance or things, of that nature. While our community were also immigrant, we were also, representing poor working class communities. We were working with people who were women who were, victims of domestic violence and other issues that other communities were also impacted as well. When it came to the fight for NYPD accountability in New York City around racial and religious profiling, again, we were playing in a field and punching above our weight because we were not getting the resources to organize for police reform in New York City. And you can, our records at the Arab American Association are public record, and to see who was funding which organization. So what ends up happening is that the most marginalized groups have to punch above our weight. We have to act like we are at the level of capacity as some of the other larger organizations or communities that were in the fight kind of quote unquote longer than us, and kind of feel like we're still there. I mean, the hustle is real when you also think about, the Islamophobia industry in the United States. There's been many reports that have been put out by the Center for American Progress, by the Council on American Islamic Relations. When we look at the amount of money from philanthropy into the quote anti-Muslim sentiment and selling, selling the myth of, radicalization and, we have to counter terrorism and all these kind of groups that you know of, we're talking about a multi-million-dollar industry, and we're talking in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But if you look at the counter to that, what has philanthropy put into building capacity of Muslim-led organizations, Arab, South Asian-led organizations over the course of 20 years, it is very small in comparison to the oppositional funding that we have seen to target our communities and to continue to push these policies like 22 anti-Sharia bills across the country, bills to limit free speech, the amounts of lawsuits that we have had against local community zoning boards on mosques. Like this didn't happen after 9/11. It took till 2010. All of a sudden we had a new problem. We couldn't build religious institutions without people fighting us in everywhere from California to New York to Michigan to Texas. So anyway, I'll just say that it really, again, goes back to, will people see our issues that impact us as Muslims and refugees, and see us in the larger context of racial justice and immigrant rights in the United States and law enforcement accountability, and actually see us as an integral community that needs to be integrated and also invested in at the same levels.
And the pace I pick up the baton from you, Linda, that I would also add is, I think back in 2001 and certainly in the 1990s, there's a certain level of insularity that was in the civil rights, racial justice groups. It was very, very tribal. And I'm not going to say which group, but I remember speaking to the board of a national civil rights organization to try to get them to focus on racial profiling after 9/11 of Muslims, Arabs, and South Asians. And I remember speaking to, the partners of these law firms that were on that was on this board. And I did not convince them that our vision of racial profiling, of removing Muslims and Arabs, was also akin to their vision of racial profiling. And I remember feeling really, really despondent walking out of that. I'm like, oh my God, how can we not see these connections? And it took us a while to build those relationships, and we stayed at it. And there was also some fantastic, I remember Brian Stevenson, for me, rocked my world when he used the word terrorism to describe what the Black community has experienced with regard to lynching in the South. And it was all of a sudden you can begin to have that intersectional conversation that Linda was talking about, because you shifted the vernacular and the vocabulary. And the moment where I felt good about the Trump moment, Linda, just so that you know, you're totally reading my mind, is that after the Muslim ban on January 27th, I was taking down my Christmas tree because it's a month later. And I put on the TV and I see all these protests at the airports, none of which we organized, right? That's not our doing. And I remember seeing people holding up signs saying, "We are all Muslims." And I swear I got chills, I got teary-eyed. I'm like, we're gonna be okay. Because look how far this country has come. I know it's imperfect. I know we're not there yet. I know Trump was a disaster. But when I saw those signs at those airports and could juxtapose that with the memory of 9/11 and the days after 9/11, I said, this country is going to be just fine. We just got to get through this moment.
Anthony, you said something earlier, and I saw that Ken and Elisa were both kind of on the edge of their seats. So I want to give them a chance to respond to this suggestion that we were too soft, collectively too soft on Obama. That we should have seen sooner, maybe, that the things that Obama was promising to do, he wasn't actually going to do, or we should have pressured him more or earlier to wind down, Guantanamo, to wind down the forever war. I mean, Ken, Elisa, what do you think? In retrospect, should we have done things differently?
I think we should have given him a much harder time. It's not like we didn't oppose him, because on Guantanamo, on the question of justice, on the scope of the global war, we opposed his positions on all of those. But I think at the same time, there was this utter relief that it wasn't Bush anymore, and that here was somebody we could deal with. I mean, Anthony, Elisa, and I were all in this meeting with Obama, his first year in office, and it was a very interesting meeting because it was like all the top national security people around the table. None of them spoke. Obama was the only one who spoke on the government side for 2 hours. And he completely held his own in terms of the substance. He was versed in it. He was interested in what we had to say. But there were a few things he said that he just was not going to budge on. I mean, one was the justice question. It was completely look forward, not back. And that was, basically about, the limit of what he thought he could do without antagonizing Republicans and jeopardizing his legislative agenda and healthcare and other things. And he just made a political calculation. And we should have been much tougher with him on that. On Guantanamo, it was interesting. He basically, we pushed him to, prosecute or release. Either bring people to a fair court, not the military commissions, or release people. And he wanted a third option. And the reason he wanted a third option is because he realized that he didn't have any viable evidence on some of the people in Guantanamo. And even though Bush had released by that point half the people there, Obama was worried about a Willie Horton situation. He didn't want somebody that he would release from Guantanamo who would then commit a serious criminal act, terrorist act. And so he just wasn't going to risk it politically. And so these were political calculations on his part. And we could have, on the one hand, supported him, and we could have noted that, of the category of people who wish America ill and might resort to terrorism, a tiny, tiny percentage happened to be living in Guantanamo. The vast majority were out there already. So this was not about, national security. This was about, the Willie Horton effect brought home. And we could have given him political cover there, but we also should have been much tougher on him than we were. And we pushed on all these things. We pushed on, his continuation of the global war on terrorism through the drone strikes. We pressed for justice. We pressed for, a lot of things. But I think still he was, deemed kind of more on our side, such a vast difference from Bush that we were not as tough as we should have.
So one thing I came to understand about Obama was you didn't have to push very hard to make him feel like you were pushing really hard. He felt pushed very hard. But Ken, I think you're absolutely right about the political dynamic. And if we're going to talk about lessons learned from all of this, I think one of the biggest lessons is, and we have to keep learning it as a movement, but on the issues that we work on, there are two kinds of conversations that happen in Washington. There's begging and there's demanding. And you can only demand if you have the political power to back it up. We got really pretty far, and we actually accomplished a fair amount with the begging and the legal arguments and all of that. But we have to build an intersectional, politically powerful movement to back up our demands. And, because Obama, he was with us. I remember that meeting well, and he wanted to do the right thing, and he wanted to, Human Rights First actually put forward a 6-month blueprint about how to close Guantanamo. And amazingly, to me, they started checking off the checklist and going down the line, and then they lost their nerve when there was political pushback. And, with the trials, they were going to try, and in fact, they did try a Guantanamo detainee in Manhattan. And, but they lost their nerve, and we didn't have the political power to push back and to give them the kind of cover that, that they felt they needed. And you could hear in Obama's, words, even though his national security folks weren't talking, the person that was talking a lot were his chief of staff and his political advisors about the risks politically for this. So, that's one of the lessons I take away from that, is that we really need to build the movement to back up so that we can have the demand conversation more than the begging conversation.
You think we're in a different position now collectively than we were then?
We are. And I think, just from the little slice that Human Rights First took on with trying to, bring in people to the movement from, prosecutors and judges and the military and interrogators and those kinds of folks, to then, have them join us, not just on the torture fight, but on Guantanamo and broader issues. That's an asset that we didn't have at the beginning, that we have now. And yeah, there were some downsides, and you raised some very important questions, Jamil, in your piece in Just Security that I hope we'll get to in the Q&A. But I think, in some ways, when I think about September 10th and kind of where we were right before 9/11, there are some ways in which we were on the brink of that, of a more, kind of intersectional movement for human rights. And it got, destroyed. It was one of the things we lost, was the momentum towards that. But ultimately, I think, as Linda pointed out, it became so stark under Trump that it regenerated that instinct in the movement. And I think that's an asset that we can hang on to for the next time we need these fights.
So I want to ask a question that came in from the audience, or a version of a question that came in from the audience, and I think it's probably mostly for Anthony and Ken. So here's a question: for a human rights organization seeking to maintain neutrality, unable to take positions on going to war, to what degree did that hamper advocacy efforts? So in other words, Human Rights Watch and the ACLU didn't oppose the wars in Iraq or Afghanistan, I don't think, but did a lot of work to expose wartime abuses. What's the justification for not taking a position on the wars themselves when everybody knows that wars lead to the very kinds of abuses that you ended up opposing?
I mean, maybe I should start with that. This is the kind of the gist of Samuel Moyn's critique, which he just gets wrong. He never bothered talking to anybody. So he kind of surmises why we do this. He thinks, we don't want to be seen as too leftist, which has nothing to do with anything. We don't take a position on whether you should go to war or not, or who has the just cause, because those are inevitably political questions, which then compromise you if you want to try to monitor the way the war is going and try to protect civilians, minimize atrocities. And so it's just kind of a necessity. The Red Cross does this. I mean, anybody who monitors wars, you've got to choose. Are you going to be a peace organization and just try to stop the war altogether? Or are you going to focus on how the war is conducted? And as a human rights group, we focused on how the war is conducted. But to be honest with the war on terrorism, it has not been an impediment for us to take on the real issues, because nobody was opposed to going to war in Afghanistan to get Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So, to spend a lot of time opposing that would have been utterly pointless. On Iraq, I mean, we did go so far as to say this is not a humanitarian intervention, which was one of Bush's justifications. He was also saying we're getting, weapons of mass destruction. But part of it was, Saddam is so terrible, this is a humanitarian intervention. When in fact, Saddam wasn't doing his most awful stuff then. He had done it back in, the Anfal genocide against the Kurds. I mean, that was ancient history at that point. So, but the real question, which I mentioned earlier, was not, do you go to war or not, but what is the war? And with the global war on terrorism, beyond the obvious armed conflicts in Afghanistan, mainly, I don't even think Iraq, I don't consider that really part of the war against terrorism. But Afghanistan was a genuine war, but everything else was a rhetorical war. And we completely fought the use of the war rhetoric, and more to the point, the relatively liberal rules on detention and killing that the laws of war bring with them, and insisted on the application of human rights standards, which require, if at all possible, detention and don't allow lethal force except as a last resort to stop an imminent threat to life. And so we were never impeded from that. And that really has been the key issue around the global war of terrorism.
I think that the piece I would add is that I also think he gets it wrong from at least the ACLU perspective, in terms of, we have, historically, we were a bunch of pacifists, right? I wasn't even born. 1920, the ACLU was literally born out of the discontent on the First World War. There was a bunch of kind of World War I dodgers who helped found the ACLU. So it was very much in the ilk of the organization from the very beginning. And then it got to be much more focused domestically. And I think historically, we've kind of largely seen, Vietnam being one example, one exception, that the waging of war is more of a foreign policy issue over which we have little expertise, or if any. And so we refrain from opining about the whether it's a just or unjust war, because it's usually having to do with foreign affairs and foreign policy, which is not our set of expertise that some of our other colleagues do. Where we have, I mean, it's funny. I saw your essay and your rejoinder to mine, so I pulled some of my own history, Ken, because I needed to remind myself. But we opposed the Iraq AUMF in 2002, not because we were against the war per se, but because we were concerned about the lack of specificity around the enemy, around the objectives, or around the geography. So we take a kind of a process approach to the declaration of war. And if it's lacking in sufficient specificity, then we will raise the objections for more of a checks and balances or kind of a division, the working of government. But I think, this idea, I think there's also a question in the chat from Gabor, who we love and appreciate, who knows this. But the idea that by focusing on trying to make the war on terror more humane, somehow we helped further the impact and the devastation of the war on other communities, I find a stretch. I don't know this fellow Moyne, but I think.
Well, I mean, to be fair, it's not just him. I mean, there are people on the right. Jack Goldsmith, makes a similar point. He's always argued that, by suing the Bush administration over this set of policies.
So when you're an advocate, you find the toehold to scale the boulder, right? I mean, look, we oppose the death penalty because we think that these drug cocktails that kind of that put your muscles, these muscle relaxants in the lethal injection don't actually impede pain, right? And so we're fighting it on the fact that it's cruel and unusual, and just because you don't see the person twitching on the death chamber doesn't mean they're not experiencing pain. That does not make us supporters of the death penalty, right? We're just good advocates. And, I think that's part of what we do, is that we take the arguments that we think are most effective. Maybe sometimes we underestimate, maybe sometimes we get it wrong. But I think the idea that we have helped sanitize these wars and whitewash them and not deal with the implications. I mean, a lot of the litigation we've done, this, Jamil. I mean, Hina continued it after you left, and Hina did a better job than you, in fact, right?
Oh, I know.
Where we've been extracting the documents from the government on the loss of civilian life in these wars, right? Where we're saying, bullshit, we don't believe you when you say that this is the number of people, civilians died in these drone attacks or in these war efforts. And I think part of why we're getting at that is to make sure that we can put the political pressure, the public pressure, on making these wars not fait accompli and not overly easy. But we're advocates, and it's ultimately, it's like, what is the strategy that makes a difference at that particular time? And it's easy in retrospect to kind of say, oh, there's a different strategy, but in the moment, I actually think that we're making good decisions. And I don't know. I don't think we become the warmongering human rights community, with all respect to my Yale colleagues.
And also, I mean, just to Moyne basically says we shouldn't be trying to make war less inhumane because it makes it easier to wage. And so the natural progression of that is let the torture take place, let the massacres occur, shoot anybody you want, make it so terrible.
Right. Let them round them all up.
Yeah, that then people, and I mean, that's just not a prescription I could possibly live by. And to think that in his speculation, that would make people turn anti-war, as opposed to just, make war even more awful than it is now. I just don't buy it.
The human rights work is by nature both incrementalist and abolitionist in terms of trying to abolish injustice, right? And it's the same argument we've had in the gay rights community about, do you accept domestic partnerships or civil unions, or do you demand marriage? Yeah,
Step by step. Yeah.
Same thing. I'll take civil union. I'll take domestic partnership, and then I'm gonna keep pushing till we get full equality.
I couldn't agree more with all of that. I think it's we have an obligation to alleviate suffering and to stop the abuses. It's one of the reasons why we took the step at Human Rights First to ask the question about torture's efficacy, because it was the primary argument being used to promote it. And we thought very carefully about asking that question, because we would still oppose it if we found that it was quote unquote working. But we don't have the luxury of just issuing statements opposing this and that without a strategy to make change. But one of the reasons why I was so excited about this conversation, Jamil, is that nor should we, I think, shy away from questioning our, decision-making back then and thinking about whether we may have inadvertently strengthened a narrative that makes the longer range change more difficult. I think those are important questions to ask. I'm glad that we're having this conversation. I'm not a fan of the, folks who are not in the arena lobbing those critiques. But I do think that we have an obligation to each other inside the community to be asking those questions. And I'm really glad that you're posing them.
Yeah,
I just pick up on Elisa's point for a second, just on the torture, because she's absolutely right that we had to take on the pragmatic arguments because the principled arguments were getting us no place. To say, oh, this is un-American or this is illegal, people said, I'm scared, I want to be saved, do whatever's necessary. And, the so-called experts said, oh, well, torture is going to make you safer. We had to take that on. I think you can go back and say, were we as effective as we should have been? Their strongest metaphor was the ticking time bomb. And they used that over and over and over, even though it's a situation that never arises, in real life. But I think we had to go pragmatic there. And I remember spending a lot of time making those pragmatic arguments. The one point where I think we made a mistake is that we allowed the discussion to be exclusively about torture. And rather than, in legalese for a moment, what's known as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, which under human rights law is also prohibited. The Bush administration said, well, we're not bound by human rights law because we're not doing this in the United States. And we're bound by the Geneva Conventions because they said it's not really that kind of a war. So they were kind of in, Never Neverland, and they said, well, we won't torture. They then defined torture out of existence. But by allowing us to allow the debate to be about torture rather than inhumane treatment, we made the whole thing a bit too foreign. And the advantage, if we had gotten people to think about inhumane treatment, do you want, the cop in your local precinct interrogating you with these techniques, which really what is the same standard, but we never got the conversation back to that. We allowed it to be about this ethereal torture that somehow, only happens overseas. And I think that was a mistake. In retrospect, I would have been pushing, the inhumane treatment part a lot and not accepted that torture is the only thing that's at stake.
Mm-hmm.
That's what Alberto Mora helped all of us do, I think, and see. And that's important for people who, weren't around during that period or weren't working on these issues, is that there were allies. We had allies inside government who saw very clearly what was happening here. And Alberto in particular, one of my heroes, fought very much against this exclusive look at torture and wrote his memo about how we can't
force drift, right? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be kind of defensive about the point that I tried to make in my piece, but I agree with everything all of you just said. It's possible that we were right to make these arguments. We had no choice but to make these arguments, but that there were also costs to making those arguments. That's kind of the way I feel about it. But we have only a few minutes left. I want to ask one broader question and let each of you, weigh in quickly on it. Just about where we are now compared to, where we were 20 years ago, both in terms of the resources, in the broadest sense of that word, resources available to the human rights community in the United States. Are we a stronger community now than we were 20 years ago? And do you feel like human rights are better protected in the United States than they were 20 years ago?
I'm going to jump in, Jamil, to reflect a little bit on what was just said, but also to answer your question. I do think it's valid that there are people who right now have, and it has crossed my mind many times, where I say burn it all down. Like we need to start from scratch. Even under the Trump administration, there was a lot of, young people that were saying, let's have, Biden is not my guy. Like, how did we get to Trump versus Biden? I mean, this is not exactly, the stalwart of human rights. And in fact, for a lot of us who are in movement, whether it be on criminal justice reform, mass incarceration, foreign policy issues, for those of us who are related to folks that are around the world, Biden represented something to us that wasn't what we were fighting for. He wasn't aligned with our movement spaces. And so for me, when I think about where I am 20 years later, where our movements are 20 years later, are we a better coordinated movement? Do we have stronger relationships? Can I pick up the phone now and maybe call Anthony in a way that I couldn't 20 years ago? Maybe I can call Ken, I can call people from different organizations and have these relationships with people across, environmental justice, immigrant rights. Yes. Do we have a bit more capacity than we did 20 years ago? Is there more solidarity? I mean, the same imagery that Anthony saw, at the airports, imagine a Muslim, watching airports across the country and people saying, we're with you. I mean, it was something that, was the culmination of 20 years of work. And I was just sitting in awe, just watching. I was actually at LAX airport when that happened. So on that level, from a movement perspective, we've moved along. And Muslim communities have gotten a lot more politically engaged. We've seen a lot more Muslim elected officials across the country, from the local to the federal level. And so all of that has happened. But when I really sit and reflect deeply, not much has really changed. I mean, the Patriot Act is still here. The National Defense Authorization Act is still here. We decimated Iraq. We literally left Afghanistan in shambles. Our foreign policy when it comes to, Palestine, Israel is, almost worse off than it was, 20 years ago. And these things are all play factors in the larger, conversation that we have around global human rights and how Americans are treated when they leave, the United States of America and go to these parts of the world. When I think about racial and religious profiling, when I think about mass incarceration, when I think about literally every issue, I mean, the mass deportations of immigrants, even under the Obama administration. I mean, how far have we really gotten? I sit sometimes and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole toward despair, but I'm like, how close are we to the promised land? Right now, we're in a fight for our lives for voting rights. I mean, why are we fighting a fight that people had 60 years ago? Why are women right now fighting? We now have a Supreme Court who Muslims already are like, look, listen, the Supreme Court was already not with us. That was before the conservative kind of appointments that recently happened, the two recent ones. And now the Supreme Court does not reflect our values, or at least the values of the movements and the communities we come from. So it's almost like, yeah, we won in some places. There have been local campaigns, local legislation, more representation. But fundamentally, on a civil liberties level, on a kind of human rights level in the United States, I don't want to be the, Debbie Downer, but I don't know. I don't see it. I don't see.
What are the rest of you think? Do you see it the same way? I didn't mean to cut you off, Linda. I just want to see if others see things in the same terms.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I mean, I agree with Linda that we've lost the Supreme Court, so the court as a route to uphold rights is much less available. On the flip side, we've lost the presumptive trust in government. There's much greater skepticism of the government doing the right thing today than there was 20 years ago, and that helps us because it is easier to mobilize around that skepticism. We also know much more. Partly just through kind of revelations through FOIA requests and the like, but also, just around the world. I mean, it's much harder for the US government to hide things like black sites or torture than it was 20 years ago. There's just between social media and everybody having a smartphone and just the stronger network of global rights groups, we know a lot about what's going on now. So it's a battle. It's always a battle. There's some things that are worse, something that's better. But I would, I think that it would be hard for, a new Bush administration to pull off something comparable this time around.
Anthony, Elisa?
Oh, okay, I'll go. So I think we are stronger as a movement, and that's a huge asset. To emphasize the positive, I feel like, Linda, you pointed out early on you know, the Trump, the silver lining or whatever you called it of the Trump administration. And I think that the extremity there, the closeness to the brink, really helped a broader, not just us in the human rights, civil rights movement, but a lot of other people who now see the way in which, and COVID's part of this too, that our fates are intertwined on racism, on climate, on policing, on, you know, just a whole range of issues. And that, I think that insight, that's never going away. And the generation coming up, I'm now at a law school, and we just launched our Human Rights Institute here, and the energy and the diversity and the, you know, just, it's really encouraging. So on that, I think now the polarization in our, you know, in the lack of the ability of our government to actually govern and solve problems, this is one of the biggest challenges. But I tend to feel optimistic about the resources that we have, just in terms of our energy and our growing power.
Anthony, you get the last word.
Oh, I'm not sure I deserve it, but I would say that I agree with Linda that it is dire circumstances for many of our communities on most of our issues. It's not the fight of our lives, it's the fight for our lives in many of these contexts and circumstances, whether it's Texas and repro or Texas and voting, or so. And I understand that it's, even when you look at the kind of relics of the war on terror, the idea that we still have military commissions were supposedly working in Guantanamo. Ken and I were bunkmates at Camp Justice back 1,000 years ago. And, you know, the idea that we may have to go back down there again before I collect my Social Security, Ken, with you and me, you know, well, to observe the military commissions is pathetic. And so I understand
easily could happen because the trial is not about to happen.
It's not about that. It's never going to happen. They can never succeed. It's destined and doomed for failure. They can never get that plane off the ground. It ain't ever flying, right? They just scrap it and put it on the junk pile of history and put it into Article 3 courts. You're totally right. But where I get optimistic is, oh my God. I mean, look, we went through 9/11. We went through Bush and Cheney, 8 years of that. We went through 8 years of a tepid Obama administration on a lot of our issues. He finally got around to gay rights because he was forced into it by a wacky vice president who got off the farm, right? Thank God for Joe Biden on gay rights. We slowly came out of that to 4 years of the Trump crucible. And you have never seen a human rights movement more energized, more dynamic, more diverse, more intersectional, who really sees the connections, who are not stuck in their silos the way I am and way my generation is. And so I have to believe, and look at all the progress we've made in these 20 years. I mean, it's just, we got gay rights, we got marriage, we didn't get it full gay rights, and they're attacking the trans community, but we made massive progress, even with a war on terror and Bush, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Obama, Gonzalez, Trump, Stephen Miller. I'd rather live in today's America than the one 20 years ago. So I'm optimistic. And I think these institutions that are now populated with a lot more altruists, who are energetic, who are sometimes challenging to lead and manage, I can tell you, but God bless them. They're asking all the hard questions, and they are ready for answers, and they're going to require those answers. And I think, how can we not be all the better for it in the end? And, you know, I think, you know, it's the folks who turned out at the airports with those signs, and the people who are populating our movements and our communities, our organizations, you know, they'll take us to the promised land, I'm sure.
And thanks for leaving us with that, Anthony. I want to apologize to everybody who asked great questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to. And also Ken, Anthony, Elisa, Linda, thanks for being here. Thanks also for your leadership over the last 20 years. I really mean that. And I know that a lot of our audience members feel the same way. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.